She gave away every meal to save hungry children. Then a silent man changed everything. The winter of 1884 came to the Wyoming Territory without mercy. It arrived weeks earlier than anyone expected, carried on bitter winds that swept across the endless prairie like a warning. The first snowfall covered the hills in a blanket of white, so thick that fences disappeared beneath it. Rivers began freezing long before Thanksgiving. The roads into town became little more than narrow trails cut through towering drifts of snow. For the families living in the valley, every sunrise brought a new worry. Would the firewood last another night? Would the livestock survive the cold? Would there be enough flour to bake bread for tomorrow? The prosperous ranchers had stored supplies during the summer, but many smaller homesteads had not been so fortunate. A poor harvest, sickness, and early frost had stolen what little they had. Children who had laughed while chasing butterflies only months before now sat quietly beside cold fireplaces, their stomachs aching with hunger. Yet every evening, as darkness settled over the valley, one small figure could be seen walking through the snow with a worn wicker basket tucked beneath her arm. The basket always started full. It never returned home that way. The woman was Miriam Hale. She was 27 years old, a widow, and the teacher of the valley's little one-room schoolhouse. Every morning before dawn, Miriam rose from the narrow bed in the tiny room she rented behind Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. The room held little more than a bed, a small table, a rocking chair that creaked whenever she sat in it, and a cast-iron stove that struggled to chase away the cold. She folded her blankets neatly, knelt beside her bed, and bowed her head. "Dear Heavenly Father," she whispered, "thank you for another day. Help me to teach these children with patience. Give strength to those who are weary. Feed those who are hungry. And if you can use these hands today, I gladly offer them." She lingered in prayer for several minutes before opening the little Bible that had once belonged to her late husband. The leather cover had grown soft from years of use. Inside the front page was a single sentence, written in his careful handwriting. "Trust the Lord when the road is bright, and when it disappears beneath the snow." Her fingers rested on those words every morning. They reminded her that God had not abandoned her, even after losing the man she loved. 3 years had passed since Jacob Hale died from pneumonia during a brutal winter. They had been married only 18 months. Sometimes the pain still felt fresh. Some mornings she still reached toward the empty side of the bed before remembering she was alone. But grief had not hardened her heart. It had softened it. Perhaps that was why she noticed hungry children before anyone else did. After dressing in her plain brown wool dress and fastening her faded blue shawl around her shoulders, Miriam stepped into the icy morning. The schoolhouse stood nearly half a mile from town. Its single chimney puffed thin grey smoke into the sky as she unlocked the door. Inside waited rows of rough wooden desks, a blackboard, shelves of worn books, and a potbelly stove that took nearly an hour to warm the room. One by one, the children arrived. Some wore boots with holes in the soles. Others had coats patched so many times that little of the original cloth remained. Still, they smiled when they saw Miss Miriam. "Good morning, Miss Hale." She greeted each child by name. "Good morning, Ben." "Lucy, your braids look beautiful today." "Thomas, did your little brother's cough get any better?" The children always seemed surprised that she remembered such things. To Miriam, every child mattered. Lessons began with prayer. She opened her Bible and smiled. "Before we learn our reading and arithmetic, let us thank the Lord for another day." Tiny heads bowed. Some children prayed confidently. Others peeked with one eye open. When the prayer ended, laughter quietly filled the room. Even in difficult times, children still found reasons to laugh. By midday, the warmth inside the schoolhouse had begun to fade. The children opened their lunch pails. Most held only a biscuit. Some had nothing at all. Miriam quietly noticed without saying a word. She reached into her own cloth bag and removed the sandwich she had packed the night before. Walking between the desks, she paused beside little Lucy. Lucy stared at her empty lap, pretending not to notice everyone else eating. Miriam smiled gently. "It seems I packed more than I can finish." Lucy looked up. "But that's yours." I already had breakfast. It wasn't true. But you'll be hungry. I'll be just fine. Lucy accepted the sandwich with trembling hands. Across the room, Ben noticed. So did two other children. Miriam simply continued teaching, as though nothing unusual had happened. When school ended that afternoon, the children hurried home through the falling snow. Miriam remained behind, sweeping the floor, erasing the blackboard, and stacking books. Only after the room was tidy did she wrap her scarf tightly around her neck and lift the familiar wicker basket. Inside rested a loaf of bread, 2 jars of soup, a handful of potatoes, several apples, and a small piece of smoked meat. It looked like enough food to keep one woman comfortable for several days. Instead, Miriam walked toward the edge of town. Her first stop was an abandoned cabin where 3 orphaned siblings lived alone. Their parents had died within weeks of each other the previous autumn. The oldest boy, Ben, was only 11. He tried desperately to care for his younger sisters. When Miriam knocked, the children opened the door immediately. "Miss Miriam," their faces lit with relief. She smiled, as though she had expected nothing less. "I thought perhaps some warm soup might taste good tonight." Ben lowered his eyes. "We don't have anything to give you." "Oh, I wasn't selling." She stepped inside. "I'm sharing." The cabin was colder than the air outside. The fire had nearly died. She added fresh wood to the stove before serving bowls of soup. The youngest girl, Emily, ate so quickly that tears filled Miriam's eyes. Children should never know hunger like this. Before leaving, she quietly slipped the loaf of bread onto the shelf beside the stove. Ben tried to stop her. "We'll owe you." She gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "You owe me nothing. But why do you keep helping us?" She smiled. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing." Ben watched silently as she disappeared into the snow. He still didn't understand. Neither did most of the town. Miriam's next stop was a weather-beaten cabin where an elderly widow named Mrs. Parker lived alone. The old woman answered the door wrapped in blankets. "Oh, child, you've come again. I brought potatoes this time." Mrs. Parker sighed. "You should be keeping these for yourself. The Lord has always provided." The widow looked into the basket. "There isn't much left." "There is enough." They prayed together before Miriam continued her journey. House after house. Cabin after cabin. The basket grew lighter. By the time she reached her own room after sunset, only a single apple remained. She placed it on the table. For several long moments she stared at it. Her stomach growled loudly. She smiled sadly. "I suppose someone else needs this more than I do." She wrapped the apple in a cloth and carried it back outside. Across the street lived a young mother with a fever and a little boy no older than 4. The child answered the knock. His eyes widened. "For me?" Miriam nodded. "For you." The little boy hugged the apple to his chest, as though it were treasure. "Thank you, Miss Miriam." Her heart felt full. Her stomach did not. Back in her room, she filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. When it warmed, she poured it into a mug and slowly drank it. The warm water eased the sharp pain of hunger, though only for a little while. Mrs. Whittaker happened to knock on her door. "I noticed you skipped supper again." "I wasn't very hungry." Mrs. Whittaker frowned. "You can't keep giving everything away." Miriam smiled gently. "I haven't given everything. You have nothing left. I still have faith." The older woman folded her arms. "Faith doesn't fill an empty stomach." Miriam looked toward the frost-covered window. "No, it fills an empty heart." Mrs. Whittaker shook her head. "You're a good woman, Miriam." "I'm simply trying to follow Jesus." After Mrs. Whittaker left, Miriam knelt once more beside her bed. "Father, thank you for feeding the children today." She paused. "If it is your will, tomorrow, please help me find enough for them again." She never asked for herself, only for others. Outside, hidden by darkness, a tall man stood across the snowy street. His broad shoulders were dusted with fresh snow. His hat was pulled low over his eyes. He had watched Miriam leave food at every cabin. He had watched her return home with nothing. He had watched her give away even the last apple. His name was Elias Boone. The quiet rancher everyone believed cared about no one. He had not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone in months. But as he stood there in the cold, something long buried stirred within him. He looked toward the light glowing through Miriam's window. Then he looked down at the untouched loaf of bread tucked beneath his own arm, meant for his supper. Without making a sound, he crossed the street. He gently placed the warm loaf on her doorstep. No note. No knock. No footprints remained by the time the wind swept through again. Then he disappeared into the darkness, before she could ever know he had been there. Inside, Miriam finished her prayer. Amen. As she rose from her knees, she heard a faint sound outside her door. Curious, she wrapped her shawl tightly around herself and stepped into the freezing night. There, resting quietly on the wooden porch, was a fresh loaf of bread. Steam still rose from its crust. She looked up and down the empty street. No one, only swirling snow. Tears gathered in her eyes. She lifted the loaf carefully against her chest. A gentle smile spread across her face. "The Lord heard," she whispered. "He always hears." Holding the warm bread close, she stepped back inside, never imagining that the silent man who had left it behind had just taken the first step toward a future neither of them could yet see. The next morning, before the sun had climbed above the snow-covered hills, Miriam awoke to the familiar sound of the winter wind pressing against her small window. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders for a moment, before remembering the loaf of bread resting on the little table beside her bed. She smiled. The sight of it filled her heart with gratitude all over again. Before touching it, she bowed her head. "Father, thank you for your kindness. You always know what your children need before we even ask. Whoever you used to bring this bread, bless them today as richly as you have blessed me." She sliced off one small piece. It was the first solid food she had eaten in nearly 2 days. She chewed slowly, savoring every bite. Then she wrapped the rest of the loaf in cloth and placed it inside her basket. As always, she intended to share it. Outside, the morning sky glowed pale gray as she made her way toward the schoolhouse. The snow squeaked beneath her boots, and the cold air turned every breath into a cloud of white. Halfway there, she noticed something unusual. Beside the schoolhouse door sat 2 bottles of fresh milk and a small sack tied neatly with twine. She looked around. The road was empty. She untied the sack. Inside were 6 eggs, a handful of carrots, and a note that contained only 4 words. For the children only. There was no signature. No clue. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Lord." The children arrived one by one. Lucy was first. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her mittens were far too large for her tiny hands. "Good morning, Miss Miriam." "Good morning, Lucy." The little girl noticed the milk immediately. "Where did that come from?" Miriam smiled. "I believe the Lord sent someone with a generous heart." Lucy nodded seriously. "Like the ravens that fed Elijah." Miriam laughed gently. "Very much like that." The other children gathered around. Their eyes grew wide when they saw the fresh food. For many of them, milk had become a rare treat. That afternoon, instead of dry biscuits, every child enjoyed warm scrambled eggs and bread toasted over the schoolhouse stove. The room echoed with laughter. Even quiet Ben smiled. Several miles outside town, Elias Boone rode slowly across his ranch. The cold wind tugged at the collar of his heavy coat. His horse moved carefully through the snow as they checked fences and cattle. The ranch stretched farther than the eye could see. Years of hard work had made Elias one of the valley's most successful ranchers. Yet anyone passing by would never have guessed it. His house was simple. His clothes were plain. He lived as though wealth meant nothing. Inside the large barn, his longtime ranch hand, Samuel Carter, stacked hay while watching Elias unload another empty milk bucket. Samuel had worked for Elias for nearly 15 years. He understood the quiet rancher better than most. "You've been leaving food somewhere." Elias continued working without answering. Samuel smiled knowingly. I counted the bread yesterday. Still no reply. And this morning, 2 bottles of milk disappeared. Elias kept shoveling hay. Finally, Samuel chuckled. You know, speaking isn't against the law. After a long silence, Elias quietly answered. They needed it. Only 3 words. But Samuel smiled anyway. They? The children. Samuel nodded. I figured. After another long pause, he asked gently, Why now? Elias stopped working. His eyes drifted toward the frosted barn window. I watched her. Samuel didn't need to ask who. She gave away everything. Silence settled between them. Then Elias spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Even her supper. Samuel rested a hand on a fence post. Your Mary used to do that. At the mention of his late wife's name, Elias closed his eyes. He remembered another winter many years earlier. Mary standing in their kitchen, wrapping fresh bread in cloth. He had asked why she kept giving away so much. She had smiled. Because God never sends us blessings, meant only for ourselves. He had laughed back then. Now those words echoed through his heart like church bells. Samuel quietly returned to work. He understood that Elias was carrying memories too heavy for conversation. That evening, before sunrise had fully broken the horizon, Elias saddled his horse again. Hidden beneath a thick blanket were flour, potatoes, smoked meat, and firewood. He stopped first at the schoolhouse, then at the cabins where he knew the orphaned children lived. He never knocked. He never waited. He simply left the supplies and rode away before anyone could see him. The valley remained asleep. Only God witnessed every gift. By afternoon, word had begun spreading through town. Mrs. Whitaker stood outside her boarding house, speaking with 2 neighbors. Someone keeps leaving food all over town. Mrs. Jenkins folded her arms. I heard Pastor Jonathan received a donation from Cheyenne. Mr. Collins disagreed. No preacher could afford that much food. Maybe it's the railroad company. Maybe a wealthy merchant. Everyone had an opinion. No one guessed the truth. Even Pastor Jonathan smiled quietly when people thanked him. He simply replied, Every good gift comes from the Lord. The days passed. Every sunrise brought another surprise. Sometimes fresh vegetables. Sometimes flour. Sometimes blankets. Sometimes wood for the stove. Never enough to waste. Always enough to meet the day's need. Miriam continued thanking God each morning. She never tried to discover the giver. She believed some acts of kindness were meant to remain between heaven and earth. One afternoon, after classes ended, Lucy lingered behind. She watched Miriam divide a fresh loaf of bread into several smaller pieces. One piece went into her own bag. The remaining pieces filled the children's lunch sacks for the next morning. Lucy tilted her head. Miss Miriam. Yes, sweetheart. Why don't you keep more? I have enough. But you always say that. Miriam smiled. Because it's true. Lucy frowned. Don't you ever get hungry? Miriam looked toward the snow falling outside the window. Sometimes. Then why do you keep giving your food away? Miriam knelt beside her. When I was a little girl, my father taught me something. What? He said that if we ever have 2 loaves of bread, and our neighbor has none, then one of those loaves was never really ours. Lucy thought quietly. But what if tomorrow there's no bread? Miriam gently touched the little girl's cheek. Then tomorrow, we'll trust God again. Lucy smiled. I want faith like yours. Miriam hugged her. Keep walking with Jesus. He'll grow it inside you. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just beyond the schoolyard fence. Elias had come to deliver another bundle of firewood before sunset. He heard every word. Tomorrow, we'll trust God again. Those 6 words followed him all the way back to his ranch. For years, he had trusted only himself, his ranch, his work, his careful planning. Somewhere after losing Mary and their infant son, trusting God had become much harder. Not because he stopped believing, because he stopped understanding. Yet this woman, she had less than anyone. Still, she trusted without hesitation. It unsettled him and inspired him. Late that night, another fierce snowstorm swept across the valley. The wind howled through the trees. Snow piled against doors and windows. By morning, several roads had completely disappeared. Parents who lived miles away could not safely reach the schoolhouse. 6 children remained stranded with Miriam. She smiled warmly. "Looks like we'll be having a sleepover." The younger children cheered. Ben looked worried. "We don't have enough wood." Miriam glanced at the nearly empty woodpile. "We'll make it last." She wasn't nearly as confident as she sounded. By evening, the fire had begun shrinking. The children huddled beneath blankets. Outside, the storm grew even worse. Then came a knock. 3 slow knocks. Everyone froze. Ben cautiously opened the door. Standing outside, covered in snow, was the silent rancher, Elias Boone. Behind him stood a wagon loaded with split firewood, thick blankets, lantern oil, bread, stew, and enough supplies for several days. Without speaking, Elias carried armful after armful inside. He rebuilt the fire until the room became warm again. The children stared in amazement. This was not the frightening man the town whispered about. This was someone who had ridden through a blizzard just to make sure they were safe. One little boy quietly asked, "Did an angel send you?" For just a moment, the corner of Elias's mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close. He reached into his coat and handed the boy a knitted pair of mittens. Then he turned toward the door. Miriam finally found her voice. "Mr. Boone." He paused. "Thank you." He nodded once. Nothing more. Then he stepped back into the storm. Lucy watched through the frosted window until he disappeared into the swirling snow. She turned toward Miriam and whispered, "I don't think he's scary." Miriam smiled softly. "No, I think he's carrying something very heavy." Far away, Elias guided his horse through the blizzard toward the lonely ranch. The storm raged around him. Yet for the first time in years, the silence inside his heart did not feel quite so empty. The storm finally passed after 3 long days. When the sun returned, it revealed a valley transformed by winter's fury. Snowdrifts towered over wagon wheels. Barn roofs sagged beneath the heavy weight of ice. Fences had disappeared beneath blankets of snow, and frozen streams cut families off from one another. For many, simply surviving another week felt like a victory. Yet while most people were busy digging paths through the snow, Miriam was already making her rounds once again. Her familiar wicker basket rested on her arm. This time, however, it carried more than usual. Fresh bread, smoked meat, beans, dried apples, flour, even a little sack of sugar. She still did not know who had been leaving the gifts. She simply thanked God every morning and shared every blessing before sunset. As she walked through town, neighbors smiled and waved. Some admired her. Others quietly shook their heads. "She'll never learn to keep anything for herself," one man muttered. His wife answered softly, "Maybe she's teaching the rest of us." At the Boone Ranch, Elias stood inside his barn, watching Samuel count the remaining sacks of grain. Samuel scratched a few figures into a notebook before looking up. "We've lost 12 head of cattle since the blizzard." Elias nodded. "I know. The hay won't last until spring if we keep feeding every family in the valley." Silence. Samuel waited. Finally he asked, "What do you want to do?" Elias walked to the barn door and looked across the snow-covered pasture. The surviving cattle searched beneath the snow for frozen grass. His father had spent 40 years building this ranch. Every animal represented years of labor, but every hungry child represented something even greater. After several moments, Elias answered quietly, "We keep sharing." Samuel sighed. "I figured you'd say that." "We'll manage." Samuel smiled. "You've started sounding like your wife." For a brief moment, grief crossed Elias's face. Instead of turning away this time, he simply whispered, "I hope so." That Sunday morning, The little church filled earlier than usual. The cold had driven people together. Inside, the old wood stove crackled, while families squeezed onto the simple benches. Pastor Jonathan stood behind the pulpit with his Bible open. His eyes slowly moved across the congregation. He noticed the widows, the tired ranchers, the children wearing patched coats. He also noticed Miriam sitting quietly near the back, and Elias standing alone beside the rear wall, as he always did. The pastor smiled gently. Our scripture today comes from the Gospel of Matthew. He read slowly. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. The church fell silent. Pastor Jonathan closed his Bible. Many people believe miracles only happen when seas part or the sick are healed. He paused. But sometimes, the greatest miracle is when God changes a human heart. Several people lowered their eyes. The words struck deeper than anyone expected. After the service ended, families slowly made their way outside. Children laughed as they threw handfuls of snow at one another. Miriam stayed behind to help fold blankets and stack hymn books. As she carried chairs toward the wall, Pastor Jonathan approached. You've been looking tired. She smiled politely. I'm fine. You've lost weight. The winter has been difficult for everyone. The pastor looked at her kindly. Miriam, she stopped. God doesn't ask you to carry the whole valley. She lowered her eyes. I know, but when I see hungry children, her voice trembled. I can't pretend not to. The pastor gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Even Jesus rested. She nodded. I'll try. But deep inside, she already knew she would continue giving everything she could. Across the room, Samuel quietly approached Elias. You're staring again. Elias looked away. I wasn't. You've watched that schoolteacher every Sunday for a month. Still no answer. Samuel chuckled. I've known you 15 years. You were never very good at hiding things. Elias frowned slightly. I'm not hiding. Then what are you doing? After a long silence, Elias finally answered. Wondering. About what? How someone with so little keeps giving so much. Samuel smiled. That's called faith. Elias looked toward the church window. I used to have that. Samuel answered gently. I don't think you lost it. I think you buried it. That afternoon, Miriam continued delivering supplies throughout town. The snow had become heavier again. Each step required effort. Still, she smiled whenever a child greeted her. Her final stop was Mrs. Parker's cabin. The elderly widow welcomed her with a warm embrace. You've brought food again. Just enough for supper. Mrs. Parker frowned. And what will you eat? Miriam laughed softly. Oh, don't worry about me. The widow looked carefully into the basket. There was almost nothing left. Only one potato, a small piece of bread, and half a jar of beans. She sighed. You've done it again. What? You've fed everyone except yourself. Miriam looked away. I'll be fine. The old woman reached for her hand. No, child. You'll pretend to be fine. There is a difference. The walk home was longer than usual. The wind had strengthened. Her legs felt strangely heavy. Several times she stopped to catch her breath. She blamed the cold. She blamed the snow. She refused to admit the truth. She had been living on almost nothing for weeks. By the time she reached the edge of town, dizziness blurred her vision. She paused beside a large pine tree. Just for a moment, she whispered. She leaned against the trunk. The world began spinning. She tried taking another step. Her knees buckled. Darkness swallowed everything. An hour later, Elias guided his horse along the same road. He had spent the afternoon repairing broken fences for an elderly rancher. The fading sunlight reflected across untouched snow. Then, something caught his eye. A basket lying upside down, bread scattered across the snow, a blue shawl. His heart raced. He urged his horse forward. Miriam! The word escaped before he even realized he had spoken. She lay unconscious beneath the pine tree. Snowflakes rested gently across her hair. Her face had become frighteningly pale. Elias jumped from the saddle. He knelt beside her. "Miriam." No response. His hands trembled. He removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her before lifting her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far less than she should have. He carried her to his horse and rode hard toward town. The doctor arrived within minutes after Elias burst through the boarding house door, carrying Miriam inside. Mrs. Whitaker gasped. "What happened?" "I found her." The doctor examined Miriam quietly. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing. Then he looked around the room. "When did she last eat?" No one answered. Mrs. Whitaker frowned. "She eats every day." The doctor looked unconvinced. "Not enough." He opened his medical bag. "She's exhausted." He hesitated before speaking again, "and severely undernourished." The room became silent. Mrs. Whitaker stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this woman has been giving away more food than she's been eating." The boarding house owner slowly covered her mouth. Memories flooded her mind. The skipped suppers, the excuses, the cups of hot water instead of meals, the untouched plates. Oh, dear Lord! Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I never saw it." News spread through the valley before morning. The schoolteacher who fed hungry children had nearly starved herself. People stood speechless. Mrs. Jenkins cried openly. Mr. Collins removed his hat. Even those who had called Miriam foolish now hung their heads in shame. Ben heard the news first. Then Lucy. Soon nearly every child gathered outside the boarding house. Lucy clutched Ben's sleeve. "Is Miss Miriam going to die?" Ben swallowed hard. "I don't know." One by one, the children began praying. Some had never prayed aloud before. Their simple voices rose into the cold winter air. "Please help Miss Miriam, Jesus. Please make her better. We still need her." Inside the room, Elias sat quietly beside Miriam's bed. The doctor had long since left. Mrs. Whitaker had gone downstairs. The fire crackled softly. For hours, Elias never moved. He simply watched her breathe. He remembered another bedside, another winter, another woman he had loved slipping away while he prayed for one more miracle. He had begged God then. The miracle had not come. His wife had died. So had their infant son. Since that day, words had become difficult. Hope had become dangerous. Yet here he was again. Waiting, praying, afraid to lose someone whose kindness had awakened his sleeping heart. As midnight approached, Miriam stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. Everything looked blurry at first. Then she recognized the room. She turned her head slightly. Elias was sitting beside her. His hands were folded tightly together. She smiled weakly. "You found me." He nodded. "You collapsed. I'm sorry." He looked at her with gentle concern. "You have nothing to apologize for." She glanced toward the window. "The children." Elias leaned closer. "They're safe. Did they eat?" He closed his eyes for a moment. Even now, after nearly dying, her first thought was someone else. Emotion overwhelmed him. Before he could stop himself, tears filled his eyes. One escaped, then another. The silent rancher who had not cried in years bowed his head. His shoulders trembled. Miriam slowly reached beneath the blanket. Her weak hand found his. She squeezed it gently. "You don't have to carry sorrow alone anymore." Elias looked at her through tear-filled eyes. For the first time since losing his family, he did not pull away from another person's kindness. Outside the window, dawn's first light began to touch the snowy valley. Neither of them realized it yet. But the hardest winter of their lives was beginning to give way to a season of healing, not only for their town, but for two hearts that God had quietly been leading toward one another all along. The news of Miriam's collapse spread across the valley faster than a prairie fire, driven by the wind. By sunrise, nearly everyone knew. The woman who had spent the winter feeding hungry children had nearly died because she had quietly gone hungry herself. No one could believe it. The blacksmith stopped hammering iron. The general store owner stood silently behind his counter. Even the men gathered outside the feed mill spoke in hushed voices. I thought she was eating at the boarding house. So did I. I saw her giving away food, but I figured she kept enough for herself. We all figured. Those words echoed through the town all morning. We all figured. Everyone had assumed someone else was looking after Miriam. Everyone believed another person would notice if she ever needed help. No one realized she had been carrying the burden alone. At the boarding house, Miriam remained weak but awake. Mrs. Whitaker refused to leave her side. She stirred chicken broth over the stove before carrying it carefully upstairs. Now, she said firmly, setting the bowl on the bedside table. You're going to drink every drop. Miriam smiled faintly. You don't have to fuss over me. Mrs. Whitaker folded her arms. Oh yes, I do. She sat beside the bed and sighed deeply. I owe you an apology. There is no need. There certainly is. The older woman's voice trembled. I called you foolish. I told you faith wouldn't fill an empty stomach. She lowered her eyes. And all this time, you were feeding everyone except yourself. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I should have seen it. Miriam gently reached for her hand. You see it now. Mrs. Whitaker nodded. That doesn't erase my blindness. Miriam smiled softly. No, but God's grace covers even our failures. The older woman looked at her in amazement. You nearly died, and you're comforting me. Miriam chuckled quietly. I suppose that's what family does. Mrs. Whitaker squeezed her hand. Then from this day forward, you'll never face another winter alone. That Sunday, the little church overflowed with people. Some families stood near the back because every bench had been filled. The atmosphere felt different. No cheerful conversations. No laughter. Only quiet reflection. Pastor Jonathan stepped to the pulpit, carrying his worn Bible. He looked across the congregation before speaking. My brothers and sisters. He paused. This week, the Lord held a mirror before our town. No one moved. We saw a woman willing to sacrifice everything. He looked toward Miriam, who sat quietly beside Mrs. Whitaker. And we saw ourselves. The church grew even quieter. Pastor Jonathan opened his Bible to the Gospel of Matthew. His voice rang clearly through the sanctuary. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. He closed the Bible gently. Many of us have admired Miss Hale's generosity. He looked around the room. But admiration without action is only another form of neglect. The words settled heavily upon every heart. I have asked myself all week, how could one woman carry so much while the rest of us carried so little? Several people lowered their heads. The pastor continued. God never intended one believer to bear the burdens of an entire community. He raised his hand toward the congregation. He calls all of us to become his hands. A deep silence followed. Then something remarkable happened. Old Mr. Collins stood. I have 3 sacks of flour. Mrs. Jenkins rose next. I've canned vegetables enough for 2 families. The blacksmith lifted his hand. I can repair broken tools without charge. A rancher near the back spoke loudly. I'll donate 2 calves. Another answered. I have firewood. Another. I'll bring blankets. Soon voices filled the church from every direction. We have potatoes. We have beans. We have fresh milk. I'll help deliver supplies. We have extra chickens. We can bake bread. Tears streamed down Pastor Jonathan's face. He smiled. This, he whispered, this is what the body of Christ looks like. Outside the church, people did not rush home. Instead, they gathered together and began making plans. Someone suggested using the old Miller storage barn that had stood empty for years. It has enough room. The roof still holds. We could store food there. Within an hour, volunteers were already cleaning it. Dusty shelves were repaired. Broken windows were replaced. Long wooden tables were built. Children swept the floors while older men patched holes in the walls. Even those with little strength found ways to serve. Mrs. Parker sat in a rocking chair near the doorway, knitting warm scarves. "No one leaves empty-handed," she declared. By sunset, what had once been an abandoned building had become something entirely new. A place of hope, a community pantry, a shelter from hunger. The following morning, wagons lined up outside the barn. One after another, families unloaded gifts: barrels of flour, sacks of potatoes, cornmeal, salted pork, warm quilts, fresh eggs, lantern oil, soap, seeds for spring planting. No one was forced. No one was pressured. They simply remembered Miriam's example. Generosity had become contagious. Meanwhile, Elias worked quietly from sunrise until evening. He repaired broken shelves, built sturdy storage bins, installed stronger doors to keep out the wind. Whenever someone thanked him, he simply nodded. Words still came slowly, but his hands spoke clearly. Ben watched him drive nails into a wooden beam. "Mr. Boone?" Elias looked up. "Can I help?" He handed the boy a hammer. "Hold this." Ben grinned. The two worked side by side for nearly an hour. Soon, another boy joined them, then another. Before long, half the older boys in town were helping Elias. Without realizing it, he was becoming the fatherly example many of them had never known. One afternoon, Lucy wandered into the barn carrying a basket of fresh biscuits. She spotted Elias lifting heavy sacks of grain. Carefully, she walked over. "Mr. Boone?" He set the sack down. "Yes, I brought these." She held out the basket. "They're for the workers." He smiled faintly. "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been resting on her heart for days. "Were you the one leaving food for Miss Miriam?" Elias looked down at the wooden floor. He never answered. Lucy smiled knowingly. "I think you were." Still silence. She stepped closer. "You know, my mama used to say that the kindest people don't always tell everyone what they've done." Elias looked at her. Her innocent words reminded him painfully of Mary. Lucy continued. "Miss Miriam says God sees everything." He nodded slowly. "He does." The little girl tilted her head. "Did God send you to help her?" Elias looked across the busy barn. He watched Miriam laughing with several children as she organized supplies. For a long moment, he simply watched. Finally, he answered, "I think—" His voice nearly broke. "I think he sent her to save me." Unknown to Elias, Miriam had stepped into the doorway just in time to hear those words. She stood perfectly still, her eyes filled with tears. She had spent months believing she was simply feeding hungry children. She never imagined that her quiet faith had also begun healing a broken man's heart. As winter slowly loosened its grip, the barn became the center of the valley's life. Every morning began with prayer. Every afternoon ended with grateful laughter. No one kept score of who gave the most. No one boasted. The strongest carried heavy loads. The elderly peeled potatoes. The children sorted canned food and folded blankets. Everyone found a place. Even Mrs. Whitaker changed. She announced that every Sunday afternoon, anyone without enough food could eat free at her boarding house. When people tried to pay, she simply smiled. "I've spent too many years counting coins. It's time I started counting blessings." One evening, after the day's work was finished, Pastor Jonathan remained behind to lock the barn. He found Elias sitting alone on an old wooden crate. The rancher stared quietly at the flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. The pastor sat beside him. "You've changed." Elias looked toward him. "I don't know." "Oh, you have." The pastor smiled. The man who stood at the back of the church wouldn't have spent all week serving beside children. Elias was silent. After several moments, he asked, "Can a man come back after walking away for so long?" Pastor Jonathan opened his Bible. He turned to the Gospel of Luke. The father ran to meet the prodigal son before the son ever reached the house. He closed the book again. God has never been the one walking away. Elias lowered his head. I stopped praying after Mary died. The words came slowly, painfully. I blamed myself. For what? I wasn't home. His voice cracked. The fever came while I was driving cattle. I got back too late. The pastor's heart ached. Elias, you could not have stopped that sickness, but I should have been there. Pastor Jonathan placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've carried guilt that never belonged to you. Tears filled Elias's eyes. The enemy has whispered that lie for years. The pastor continued softly. Christ already carried your burden to the cross. You don't have to keep carrying it. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the soft crackling of the lantern flame. Finally, Elias bowed his head. The words came quietly, almost like the prayer of a child. Lord, I'm tired. His shoulders shook. I'm tired of living like my heart died. A single tear rolled down his weathered face. Pastor Jonathan smiled gently. Then let today be the day you begin living again. Across the snowy valley, the lights inside the community barn glowed warmly against the winter night. Travelers passing through could hear laughter drifting into the cold air. Children no longer feared going to bed hungry. Widows no longer faced empty cupboards alone. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now worked side by side like family. And at the center of it all stood a quiet schoolteacher whose simple decision to give away one meal at a time had awakened an entire town. None of them realized that spring was drawing near, not just for the frozen fields, but for hearts that had been locked beneath the ice of grief, pride, fear, and indifference. God was doing far more than filling empty stomachs. He was rebuilding a community, one act of love at a time. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. The thick blanket of snow that had covered the Wyoming Valley for months began to melt beneath the warmth of the sun. Streams burst free from the ice, rushing happily through fields that had seemed lifeless only weeks before. Green shoots pushed through the softened earth, wildflowers appeared along the hillsides, and birds returned with cheerful songs that had been absent throughout the long winter. The people of the valley welcomed the season with grateful hearts. Children who had spent months indoors now chased one another through muddy fields, laughing as though they had never known hunger. Farmers repaired fences and prepared their land for planting. The community barn remained busy every day, though its purpose had changed. Instead of simply distributing food, it had become a place where neighbors gathered to work together. Some baked bread, others sewed quilts. The older boys repaired wagons. The girls helped prepare meals for elderly widows. The valley no longer waited for one woman to notice every need. Everyone had begun looking around with new eyes. Miriam stood outside the schoolhouse one warm April afternoon, watching the children race toward the creek. Lucy turned and waved. "Miss Miriam, watch me!" The little girl skipped across a fallen log that served as a bridge. "You've become very brave," Miriam called. Lucy laughed. "I wasn't brave before." "Oh? I was just hungry." Miriam smiled sadly. "Children should never have to make such a distinction." Nearby, Ben and several boys were repairing the old school fence under Elias's direction. "Hold the post steady," Elias instructed. Ben grinned. "Like this? A little straighter. There? Perfect." The boys exchanged proud smiles whenever Elias praised their work. Weeks earlier, the silent rancher had barely spoken. Now, although still a man of few words, he no longer avoided conversation. His voice remained quiet, gentle, carefully chosen, but it was heard every day. Samuel leaned against the fence, watching the scene with amusement. "I hardly recognize you anymore." Elias continued hammering. "I've always looked like this." Samuel laughed. "You know exactly what I mean." Elias drove another nail into the wood. The boys needed help. "No." Samuel folded his arms. "You needed them." Elias paused. He glanced toward Ben, who was proudly measuring another section of fence. The boy reminded him of the son he had buried before the child had even learned to walk. Instead of bringing pain, the memory now brought something else. Longing. Hope, he quietly admitted. Maybe, Samuel smiled. Mary would be pleased. Elias looked toward the sky. I hope she's smiling. I believe she is. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning Miriam taught her lessons. Every afternoon she visited families in need. The difference now was that she was never alone. Sometimes Lucy carried baskets beside her. Other days Ben pushed a small wagon filled with supplies. Quite often, Elias simply appeared without being asked. If a widow needed firewood, he chopped it. If a roof leaked, he repaired it. If a family lost a calf, he helped replace it. He never sought recognition. He simply served. One afternoon, Miriam watched him patiently repairing Mrs. Parker's broken porch. The elderly widow leaned toward Miriam and whispered, "That man loves you." Miriam nearly dropped the basket she was holding. "Oh no," Mrs. Parker chuckled. "My dear, I've lived 78 years. I know what love looks like." Miriam felt her cheeks grow warm. "He's simply kind." "He is." The widow smiled knowingly. But kindness is often where love begins. Several evenings each week, Pastor Jonathan invited anyone who wished to join him for Bible study at the church. At first, only a handful attended. Soon the room filled. One evening, Pastor Jonathan read from the book of Isaiah, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." Afterward he asked, "What keeps people from accepting God's peace?" Different voices answered, "Fear, pride, shame, bitterness." Finally, the pastor looked toward Elias. "And you?" The room grew quiet. Everyone knew Elias rarely spoke in groups. For a long moment, he stared at the floor. Then he slowly stood. "I thought—" He paused. "I thought God had forgotten me." Silence settled across the room. "When Mary and our son died," his voice trembled. "I kept asking why. No one interrupted. I waited for an answer. I never heard one." He swallowed hard. "So I stopped asking." He looked around the room. "I didn't stop believing. I just stopped talking." Miriam watched him with tears in her eyes. Elias continued, "But these past months," he glanced toward her, "I've watched someone trust God every single day. Even when she had nothing. Even when she nearly died." His eyes filled with tears. I realized God hadn't stopped speaking. I had stopped listening. The room remained completely silent. Then Pastor Jonathan smiled. "Welcome home, brother." Several men quietly stood and embraced Elias. No speeches, no applause. Only the quiet joy of a family welcoming one of its own. A few days later, Elias saddled his horse before sunrise. He rode alone toward a small hill overlooking the valley. At the top stood two simple wooden crosses. One marked the resting place of Mary Boone. The other belonged to the infant son they had named Caleb. Wildflowers had begun blooming around the graves. Elias removed his hat. For a long while he simply stood in silence. Then he knelt. His hands rested upon the weathered wood. "I've come every spring." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I always asked why you were taken." He looked toward the rising sun. "I don't think I'll ever understand." He smiled sadly. "But I don't think I need to." A gentle breeze swept across the hill. "I'll always love you, and I'll always thank God that He gave me the years we shared." He paused. "For a long time, I thought loving you meant I had to stop living." His eyes filled with tears. "I know now that isn't true." He placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at Mary's cross. "If you can see me, I hope you know. I'm trying again." He bowed his head. "Thank you, Lord, for carrying me when I refused to walk." Peace settled over him like the warmth of the morning sun. For the first time since their deaths, he left the hill without feeling guilty. He left, carrying hope. Later that week, The valley gathered for its annual spring picnic beside the river. Long wooden tables overflowed with homemade food. Children played games. Musicians brought fiddles. Laughter echoed through the trees. Mrs. Whitaker proudly carried out several pies. "You'll all be pleased to know," she announced, "none of these are burnt." Everyone laughed, even Elias. It was a genuine laugh. Rich and warm. The sound startled Samuel so much that he nearly dropped his coffee. "There it is," Samuel exclaimed. "We thought you'd forgotten how." The children turned toward Elias. Lucy giggled. "Mr. Boone laughs funny." Elias laughed even harder. Miriam smiled from across the field. She had never seen him look so free. As evening approached, the crowd slowly drifted home. The golden light of sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and gold. Elias walked toward Miriam. His hands were tucked nervously into his pockets. "There is somewhere I'd like to show you." She smiled. "I'd like that." They walked together through a meadow where wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze. Neither felt the need to hurry. Silence between them had become comfortable, not empty, peaceful. Eventually they reached a hill overlooking the valley. Below them lay the ranches, the church, the schoolhouse, the community barn. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys as families prepared supper. "It looks different," Miriam said. Elias nodded. "It does." "The valley?" He smiled. "No, I do." They stood quietly for several moments. Finally, Elias took a deep breath. "I've rehearsed this conversation for days." She looked at him with gentle encouragement. "I've never been very good with words." "I don't believe that." He laughed softly. "I spent years proving otherwise." Miriam smiled. "Go on." Elias looked across the valley. "For a long time, I believed my story had already ended. I thought God had left me alive simply to remember what I'd lost." He turned toward her. "Then I met a woman who gave away every meal she had." She lowered her eyes. "You make me sound far better than I am." "You are exactly who I'm talking about." His voice became steadier. "You reminded me that faith isn't measured by what we keep. It's measured by what we're willing to trust God with." He slowly reached into his coat. Instead of a ring box, he held a small leather Bible. Its edges were worn with age. It belonged to Mary. Miriam looked surprised. "I've carried it everywhere since she died." He carefully placed it in her hands. "The day I buried her, I thought I'd never be able to share my life with another person." He swallowed. "I was wrong." He stepped closer. "I'll never stop loving the family God first gave me. But loving them doesn't keep me from loving again." Tears shimmered in Miriam's eyes. He reached into another pocket and removed a simple gold ring. His hands trembled. "Miriam Hale." He lowered himself onto one knee. The evening breeze rustled through the tall grass around them. "I don't have beautiful speeches. I only have an honest heart. You brought life back into a place I believed was dead. You reminded me that God's mercy is new every morning. You showed me that giving is richer than keeping. And without trying, you taught a silent man how to speak again." He looked into her eyes. "Would you do me the greatest honor of my life? Would you walk beside me for the rest of our days? Would you help me feed hungry hearts, raise children who know the Lord, and build a home where no one is ever turned away?" Miriam covered her mouth as tears flowed freely down her cheeks. For several moments she could not speak. Finally she whispered, "Before Jacob died," she looked toward heaven. "He prayed that if the Lord ever called him home before me, God would someday send someone who loved Jesus more than he loved himself." She smiled through tears. "I didn't think such a man existed." She gently extended her hand. "Yes, Elias, with all my heart." He carefully slipped the ring onto her finger. They stood together beneath the fading sunset. No grand celebration, no audience. Only two faithful hearts standing before the God who had written their story long before they ever met. As they bowed their heads, Elias prayed aloud without hesitation. "Father, thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself. Thank you for turning my mourning into hope. Help me to love Miriam as Christ loves his church, with patience, humility, sacrifice, and joy." Miriam softly added, "And help us never forget the hungry, the lonely, and the forgotten." "Amen," they whispered together. Far below, the church bell rang across the valley, its gentle sound floating through the evening air. It felt less like a coincidence and more like heaven itself rejoicing. The silent man had found his voice, and with it, he had found the future God had patiently been preparing all along. The news of Elias Boone's engagement to Miriam Hale spread through the valley long before the couple announced it themselves. Lucy was responsible. She had overheard Samuel telling Pastor Jonathan after Sunday service. By lunchtime, she had whispered it to Ben. Ben had told 3 boys while repairing the church fence. Before sunset, nearly every family within 20 miles knew. Mrs. Whitaker laughed when she heard the rumors. "I suppose there's no use trying to keep a secret from children." Pastor Jonathan smiled. "The Lord certainly chose the fastest messengers." When Miriam walked into the schoolhouse the following morning, every child wore an enormous grin. Lucy ran straight toward her. "Miss Miriam!" Miriam smiled. "Good morning." Lucy stared at the ring on her finger. "Is it true? What have you heard?" "That Mr. Boone asked you to marry him." The classroom erupted with excitement. Ben crossed his arms proudly. "I knew he'd do it." One little boy frowned. "Does that mean you'll stop teaching us?" Miriam knelt beside him. "Oh no, I'll always be your teacher." The little boy smiled with relief. "Good. You explain arithmetic better than anybody." The room burst into laughter. Even Miriam laughed until tears gathered in her eyes. Joy had returned to the valley. Real joy. Not the kind that depended on good weather or full barns. The kind that grew from grateful hearts. The wedding was planned for early June. Neither Miriam nor Elias wanted a grand celebration. "We've spent enough of our lives counting what matters," Elias told Pastor Jonathan. "We don't need expensive decorations. We already have everything we need." Word spread quickly. The townspeople refused to let the couple prepare alone. Mrs. Whitaker organized the women to sew a beautiful wedding dress. "I've made dresses for wealthy women," she declared. "This one will be my favorite." Mrs. Parker embroidered tiny wildflowers along the sleeves. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," she admitted with a smile. "But I can still stitch love into every thread." The blacksmith forged simple iron lantern holders for the church. The carpenter built new pews. Children gathered wildflowers from the hills. Even the older ranchers spent an afternoon repairing the church roof. "No leaks over a bride's head," Mr. Collins insisted. Samuel quietly restored an old wagon so Miriam could ride to the church. When Elias thanked him, Samuel simply shrugged. "You helped rebuild all our hearts. It's the least we can do." The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a bright blue sky. Gentle breezes carried the scent of blooming sage and fresh grass. The little white church had never looked more beautiful. Wildflowers decorated every window. Garlands of greenery wrapped around the doorway. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows, filling the room with warmth. Families arrived early. Children sat in the front pews, fidgeting with excitement. Pastor Jonathan stood near the altar, smiling as he greeted each guest. Then the church doors opened. Everyone stood. Miriam entered quietly. Her ivory dress was simple. No jewels, no lace imported from distant cities, only careful stitches made by loving hands. A small bouquet of wildflowers rested in her hands. Mrs. Whitaker walked beside her. Halfway down the aisle, she whispered, "I always dreamed I'd see my own daughter married." Miriam squeezed her hand. "You are today." The older woman blinked away tears. At the front of the church, Elias waited. His hands trembled. Samuel leaned close. "You've faced stampeding cattle. You've survived blizzards. You can survive saying, 'I do.'" Elias smiled. "I hope so." When Miriam reached him, he forgot everyone else in the room. Only her remained. Pastor Jonathan opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today before God, and these witnesses. The familiar words carried special meaning. These two people had already demonstrated what sacrificial love looked like long before they stood at the altar. When it came time for the vows, Elias spoke first. His voice remained quiet. But every word carried the weight of truth. Miriam, I promise before God to protect you, to pray with you, to serve beside you, to rejoice with you. And when difficult seasons come again, I promise we will face them together, never alone. Tears rolled freely down Miriam's cheeks. She answered, Elias, I promise to honor you, to encourage you, to remind you of God's promises whenever your heart grows weary. I promise that our home will always belong to the Lord. And I promise, she smiled through tears, there will always be room at our table for one more. Pastor Jonathan's own voice trembled. By the authority given to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The church erupted with joyful applause. Children cheered loudly. Mrs. Whitaker cried openly. Samuel wiped his eyes before pretending dust had gotten into them. Outside, church bells rang across the valley. For the first time in many years, the sound seemed to carry pure celebration. Life as husband and wife began with a decision that surprised no one. 3 days after returning from a short visit to a nearby lake, Elias gathered several men inside one of his largest barns. This building is too empty. The men looked around. It could hold hundreds of cattle. Elias nodded. It could, but I'd rather fill it with people. Within weeks, the barn was transformed. Long wooden tables stretched from one end to the other. A large kitchen was built along one wall. Massive stoves filled the room with warmth. Shelves overflowed with flour, vegetables, canned fruit, and fresh bread. A sign carved by Ben hung above the entrance. Welcome. There is always room for one more. Every evening, lanterns glowed inside the great barn. Travelers stopped for warm meals. Widows found companionship instead of loneliness. Children laughed as they carried bowls of stew to newcomers. No one asked whether visitors could pay. No one checked where they came from. Everyone was welcomed. Every meal began the same way. Elias stood. Heads bowed. He prayed. Father, thank you for this food. Thank you for every hand that prepared it. Bless those who have little. And teach us never to forget that everything we have belongs first to you. Amen. The tables echoed with joyful conversation. The years passed gently. God blessed the Boone Ranch beyond anything Elias had imagined. The cattle multiplied. The harvests became plentiful. The orchards produced abundant fruit. Yet as the ranch prospered, so did the couple's generosity. Their giving grew faster than their wealth. Whenever someone asked Elias why he never worried about running out, he smiled. I've seen what happens when one loaf of bread is placed in God's hands. One autumn afternoon, Pastor Jonathan arrived carrying exciting news. There are 2 children in Cheyenne, a brother and sister. Their parents died during the fever. They need a home. Miriam looked at Elias. No words were necessary. They already knew. Several weeks later, the children arrived. 8-year-old Anna clung tightly to her little brother, Joseph. Both looked frightened. Miriam knelt. You don't have to be afraid, Joseph whispered. Are we staying? Elias smiled warmly. If you'll have us, we'd like you to stay forever. The little boy blinked. Forever? Forever. Soon Lucy and Ben officially joined the Boone family as well. The ranch house that had once echoed with silence became wonderfully noisy. Boots lined the porch. Laughter filled the halls. Family prayers grew longer because there were more voices thanking God. At supper, the children often talked over one another. One evening, Elias simply leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. He smiled. Miriam noticed. What are you thinking? He looked around the crowded table. I'm listening. To what? He laughed softly. the sound I prayed I'd hear again. She reached across the table and took his hand. 20 years passed. The valley changed. The tiny schoolhouse became larger. New ranches appeared. Families settled throughout the region. Travelers passing through Wyoming often heard stories about the Boone Ranch. Some expected to see the finest cattle. Others expected the largest house. Instead, they discovered something unexpected. Hospitality. Kindness. A table that never seemed empty. People often asked, "How do you afford to feed so many?" Miriam would simply smile. We stopped trying to count. One reporter traveling west wrote in his newspaper, "There is a ranch where strangers become neighbors before dessert is served." Another visitor wrote, "The Boone family treats every guest as though Christ himself has come to supper." The reputation spread far beyond Wyoming, not because of riches, because of love. One golden evening, many years later, Miriam and Elias sat together on the front porch. Their hair had turned silver. Their hands were weathered by years of honest work. Across the yard, grandchildren chased one another beneath the cottonwood trees. Lucy, now a mother herself, supervised several children preparing bread. Ben laughed as he taught boys to repair a fence, just as Elias once taught him. Inside the great community barn, long tables were already filling for the evening meal. The tradition had never ended. Miriam watched quietly. "Do you remember the first loaf of bread?" Elias smiled. "I do." "You never told me it was you." "I wasn't trying to." She laughed gently. "I know." He looked toward the busy barn. "I thought I was leaving bread for a hungry woman. And instead—" He turned toward her. God was feeding a hungry man. Miriam leaned her head against his shoulder. "The Lord answered both our prayers." He nodded. He certainly did. For several peaceful moments, neither spoke. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold. Children laughed in the distance. Church bells rang softly across the fields. Finally, Elias whispered the words he once believed he would never speak again. "The Lord restored everything." Miriam smiled. "No." She looked toward the crowded tables where strangers, widows, travelers, ranchers, and children all shared the same meal. "He gave us even more than we lost." Elias looked across the valley, his eyes filled with grateful tears. "You're right. He gave us a family." As the first stars appeared overhead, the great dinner bell rang across the ranch. People began making their way toward the community barn from every direction. No invitations were needed. Everyone knew they were welcome. Everyone knew there would be enough. And there always was. For years, travelers wondered how the Boone family never seemed to run out of food. The answer was never found in the size of their harvest or the number of their cattle. It was found in a lesson that had begun many winters before, when one faithful woman quietly gave away every meal she had. God had taken a single loaf of bread, one hidden act of kindness, one silent man, and one courageous woman, and from those small beginnings, he had built a legacy that would feed bodies, restore hearts, and point countless souls to his unfailing love. Final scripture. "And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." Galatians 6:9. The end.